Thank you for joining our international virtual conference, COVID-19, a game changer in education, connecting virtually. Let me welcome Dr. Bryan Goodwin, CEO and President of McREL International, based in Denver, Colorado. Dear attendees, please take advantage of the chat space at the bottom of your screen to write your questions for Dr. Goodwin, as we will allow some time at the end of the session to address your inquiries. Dr. Goodwin will discuss confronting COVID-19 in the USA, Australia, and Pacific, seizing the moment to create a better normal. Again, welcome, Dr. Goodwin. If you turn your mic on, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ockwell. I appreciate it. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. As Dr. Ockwell stated, I work at MacREL International, lead MacREL International. We are based in Denver, Colorado. We do work all across the U.S. We also have been supporting schools for a number of years all across Australia as well. And we have an office in Honolulu, Hawaii, where we serve the Pacific region. So I wanted to share with you this afternoon a few of the things that we are learning from and with these schools, especially as they've been engaged in this rapid and sudden shift to online learning during the pandemic. First off, though, I want to acknowledge how we're probably all feeling right now. Like everything is falling apart. As of this week, here in the U.S., it's been a full 9 months since we first shut everything down because of the pandemic. My wife and I, for example, we've been working from home since March. My kids have I have daughters, they've just come back to learning at home, learning online. And I don't know about at your house, but I find that here in my house, it feels like everything is breaking. Our oven broke, our dishwasher broke, handles are falling off of cabinets. I've had door hinges breaking. Yesterday, I was just informed that our shower head is no longer working, so I'll put that on my Saturday to-do list today. At first, it seemed like everything was falling apart because of COVID. And then I realized something that, no, it's just deferred maintenance. It's stuff that I've let go too long that's not falling apart. And I have a house full of people here, and we're all using everything more. And I think, in a way, something similar has happened in our schools. As they made this sudden shift to online learning, a lot of things seem to suddenly fall apart. According to some estimates, students have lost anywhere from a third to a half a year of learning, 4 to 6 months of learning, just in the last last spring alone. In some places in the U.S., we know that schools are actually finishing with only about 1 in 5 students still participating in online learning. And certainly that has, and we also know that those gaps are a lot more pronounced for students in poverty and students of color here in the U.S. Now, certainly a lot of that has to do with internet access. It also has to do with families being unable to find a quiet place for students to learn in their homes. Or, it has to do with, parents being unable to be at home and supervise their children as they're learning. Yet the participation rates had begun much higher, and then they dropped, which also suggests that kids were still able to get online, but were simply opting to check out. And at first blush, that might seem to suggest everything was fine with our schools until COVID-19 hit. But now what I really think happened was that this sudden shift to online learning just revealed cracks that were already present in the system, a system that's been built on faulty premises. You might think of them as like stress cracks, right? As we put more weight on the foundation, we started to see these cracks hit. And I think in a lot of ways, what we did here in the U.S. and I think all around the world was we took what wasn't working in face-to-face, right? Kids were disengaged, they were checked out, and we put that online. And in fact, that's what we learned at McREL when we brought students together into focus groups and we asked them questions about what their learning experiences have been, both before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And here's what they told us. They said, a lot of them have really good teachers. And they said those teachers who are engaging and who are providing dynamic learning experiences before the pandemic are still doing all right now, right? And the students would buy them quite a bit of grace saying, I can appreciate what my teachers are doing. However, there were a lot of teachers who were not engaging, not successful, not effective before the pandemic, and those teachers have become actually pretty horrible now. And they're providing their students with a lot of busy work and not a whole lot of meaningful interaction with their students. So in short, this whole shift to online learning has just revealed the uneven distribution of teacher quality in many places around the US and the world. Effective teachers have stayed fairly effective and ineffective ones have gotten considerably worse. So as it turns out, I've spent a lot of my career thinking, researching, and writing about this question. How do we make learning experiences both challenging and engaging for our students? My organization, Mackrell International, has in fact dedicated itself to helping teachers and school leaders worldwide create amazing learning experiences for students. Now, I have to admit that kids being bored is not a new phenomenon. In fact, I have something of an awkward confession to make, especially in front of a group of educators like yourself. And it was this. I was a pretty disengaged student myself when I was in high school. In fact, I think I remember a teacher telling me or yelling at me, saying, you with the 10-second attention span, turn around and shut up. And he probably said some other stuff. I'm not sure what it was because I think by that point I wasn't paying attention anymore. Now, fortunately, all of that changed when I got to college and I became a good student. It was actually a pretty dramatic transformation. You know, at first, I think I probably dug into my studies simply because my father had warned me if I didn't apply myself and do well in college, I'd be coming right back home. And that was enough of an incentive at first. But I think once I dug into my studies and I discovered something about myself, which was that I loved learning. I loved being curious and I loved seeing where that curiosity could lead me. And in a way, that curiosity was almost like a magic potion, right? It turned me into a dedicated student. As fate would have it, just 6 years after being in high school, I found myself back in a high school as a teacher, teaching a group of young people who reminded me a lot of myself when I'd been in high school. You know, they were maybe a bit jaded, weary of school, staring out the window, wishing they could be somewhere else, anywhere else but my classroom. And this is where I landed. It was a small school in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And in many ways, you know, I think I found myself hoping to help my students become what I had never been in high school, which was motivated to learn. So I taught ninth grade English, 10th grade American literature, 11th grade Caribbean history, 12th grade world literature. I was also the advisor for the school newspaper. I supported the school musical as the stage manager. And then in my spare time, I also coached soccer, basketball, and baseball. Did I mention it was a small school? So I was really dedicated to my students. I was giving a lot of myself to my students. And this is where, you know, here's my classroom. Here's where all the magic happened, or maybe rather didn't happen. I had hoped to be this amazing, dynamic teacher, yet I know I never quite reached that level. Despite all of my efforts, all of my hard work, looking back now, you know, I realized that I was amazingly adequate. I had amazing students though, right? I wanted to help them love learning the same way I'd learned to love learning when I was in college. I wanted to give them some of that magic potion. Only at the time, I don't think I quite understood or figured out what that magic potion had been for me. So that has led me, though, on a lifelong quest to figure out what really motivates students. And here's the biggest thing that I have figured out. The most powerful way to motivate anyone is to help them become intrinsically motivated to learn. Not because someone's telling them to do something or because they feel compelled to do it, but rather because they find it personally rewarding and aligned with their own interests and goals. And so that understanding has led me to this insight. For the most part, how we go about motivating students and teachers and how we design learning experiences for our students and how we go about improving our schools is just all wrong, right? Which I think this current crisis is laying bare. Basically, we're seeing now these stress cracks in the faulty foundation of our education system. And I would suggest there are three key cracks or fundamental flaws in our current approaches to teaching and schooling. Here's the first, is that we rely too much on external rewards like grades, consequences, stickers, and prizes, rather than intrinsic rewards to motivate students. Allow me to explain. You know, often the best answer we can give students when they ask us why they must learn something is because we say, well, it's on the test, right? And if you don't do well on the test, you won't get a good grade. And if you don't get a good grade, you won't get to go on to college, where you can repeat the process all over again, taking tests and getting grades. And so basically, we're just setting up a lot of hoops for students that we have to jump through. Now, some students are pretty successful in jumping through those hoops. They start to learn the system, right? Maybe they game the system, right? But what happens, though, sometimes we find that good students or kids who are good in school sometimes struggle in life, right? They're not so good at life, or because when they encounter the real world, which is far more ambiguous, far more complex and subjective than the classroom, they tend to struggle. But I think what we have to step back for a moment and realize is that our reliance on external rewards, trying to motivate kids through from something outside themselves, really suggests that as educators, as adults, we haven't figured out why we want students to learn what we're asking them to learn, right? Our only answer is, well, it's on the test. So I want you just for a moment, though, to step back and think about something that you have mastered, that you've become really good at. Maybe it's a sport, a musical instrument, maybe it's an artistic talent, or maybe it's an academic or professional pursuit. Likely what made you stick with that pursuit was because it wasn't someone breathing down your neck, but because at some point you decided that it was important to you. You were intrinsically motivated to improve your skills or to invest your time in learning something because you found it appealing to do so. You enjoyed, for example, entertaining others with your musical talents or hitting that three-point jump shot on the basketball court. You know, for example, for myself, I don't stay up late at night and give up my weekends. I do writing, you know, I do a lot of writing. But I don't do that because I want to become rich and famous. I'm not. Nor do I wake up at 4 a.m. to be with folks like you and deliver presentations like this. So just because Dr. Ockwell is persuasive, he is, but that's not why I do this. I do this because I love it, right? And I'm sure you all have something in your life that you love just as much and that you do for the same reason, because for you, it brings you its own rewards. But that's not really how we motivate our students in school. Instead, we rely on extrinsic rewards, carrots and sticks, if you will, namely grades, right? To get them to learn boring stuff that we want them to learn. So instead of using curiosity or engagement to motivate students, we resort to carrots and sticks. So that brings me to, I think, the second kind of fatal flaw or fundamental flaw in our current approach to schooling, which is this. Because we hitch everything to extrinsic rewards, then we design learning around what we can test or what we can put on a test. As a result, the whole process of learning becomes one of basically attempting to download stuff into students' minds, test them on it, and then move on to the next thing. It's really kind of like this. We teach something, right? And then we ask students to practice or to study it, and then we test them on it. And then what do? We repeat the entire process, right? Instead of doing things like this, giving them projects, giving them research investigations they can do, or presentations, which we know actually lead to deeper learning, right? So I know sometimes teachers will say, yeah, but I don't have time to do all of that, right? My job is to teach the curriculum to the students. Their job is to learn it, and then we have to move on. And yet, I'll ask you to think about one thing, though. Studies also show this. Students tend to forget 90% of what they've learned in the classroom within 30 days. So think about that for a moment, right? That's a 10% success rate. You wouldn't want your doctor or your airline pilot saying, don't worry, I get great results 10% of the time. So that brings us to, I think, the third fundamental flaw in how we go about schooling. It's in how we approach school improvement. In schools across the U.S. and the world, we see an over-reliance on kind of ready-made solutions and quick fixes to improve student outcomes, right? Adopting a new math program or a reading curriculum or a digital solution, right? Especially right now. You know, sometimes these quick fixes, they do work, especially when they provide some consistency and some coherence to maybe what was otherwise or beforehand uneven or inconsistent practices. Yet, though, ultimately, these quick fixes fail to address the underlying cracks in the system, right? Our students are still bored, they're still disengaged, they're still forgetting most of what they learn. And moreover, I think this approach to improvement fails to build the capacity of our teachers to operate as true professionals who can diagnose and solve problems with student learning, who can work together like doctors would to figure out what a better solution is and develop more effective student learning experiences. So as a result, we never really solve our underlying problems. Here's the good news, though. And I think the reason we should all be optimistic that something good, maybe even amazing, can come out of this current pandemic. Worldwide, we're seeing schools reaching a breaking point. They're realizing this old adage that every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it does. And so they're realizing that if our students are disengaged, if they're not remembering what they're learning, it's because we have actually designed our schools for that outcome. And I think a lot of leaders are seeing that our current approaches to school improvement, these quick fixes, are leaving us constantly changing but never getting better. And in this moment, we're seeing a lot of forward-thinking leaders that are stepping up and saying, I want to look beyond this crisis. They're saying, I want my school to do more than just go back to normal. I want to create a better normal. And that starts with recognizing that these flaws in how we've designed our current system, and first of all, recognizing the flaws and then considering how we could redesign our schools around a better set of more powerful design principles. So let me share a few of those with you. I think the first one is this. It's really unleashing student curiosity. When I was in Qatar last year, I spoke at the National Education Conference about the power of curiosity. I shared how brain research and studies are showing that not only is curiosity a powerful motivator of learning, but that when we are curious, we actually retain more of what we're learning when it's fueled by curiosity. I think the greatest thing about curiosity is simply this, that we are all born curious. No one needs to teach us how to be curious. If you're a parent of a toddler or a grandparent of a toddler, or remember your own kids being young, you know that's true. Kids are born curious. They are full of questions, literally hundreds of questions per day. As it turns out, so curiosity is really a trait that we all share as human beings. And I found myself thinking this, I was struck by this also last year when I was in Qatar, and I visited a couple of your amazing museums, right? The National Museum of Qatar and also the Islamic Museum of Art. And what I noticed was there was a long line of people outside of the museum in the morning, all day actually, lined up to get in, right? They were happily giving up their free time, their money to go to a museum. And to do what? To go learn stuff, right? Meanwhile, while kids are in school, we feel like we have to dangle grades and other rewards in front of them just to get them to do something that on their own they might otherwise happily do if learning were just presented to them as in a more interesting and compelling way. So what would that mean? What would that look like? How could we build our schools around curiosity? Well, I could talk about this all day, and I often do, but I'll keep it simple. Let me just give you one big idea here. I think it would be, instead of launching units the normal way with no sense of wonder or mystery, saying, for example, for the next 3 weeks, we are going to study photosynthesis, so open in your books to chapter 4. We might instead take a different approach and frame learning around big questions or mysteries. And this is something we've seen schools in Australia do. This is from Glenroy Central Primary School in Melbourne, Australia. Their teachers have been working together to develop 3 or 4 week curricular units that are framed around big questions like this one. How are plants captivating? How do plants take what's in the environment and turn them into something that grows, right? That's a mystery for kids. And they call these investigations. And so they will still devote their mornings to developing students' basic reading and math skills. But every afternoon, right after lunch, as the kids come in from the yard, they engage in these investigations, these cross-curricular units that are focused on these essential questions. And you can see artifacts of these investigations all over the school. And here's an example. This was posted on a wall. You can see scientific vocabulary terms that they're learning. And more importantly, I was there at lunch one day, and I watched the students coming in after lunch. You could see the excitement on their faces. They could not wait to get into school. It was like going into a museum for them because they were engaged in these investigations. So right now here in the U.S., as teachers have made this rapid shift to online learning, a number of them are seeing that it's opening up new possibilities for them, ways to make learning more interesting. For example, in some schools that we've been helping to build their learning around curiosity in order to drive learning, we're seeing teachers who are, while they're teaching at home and while their kids are at home, they're realizing they can create these backyard classrooms and use really intriguing questions to drive learning. For example, one teacher was saying, okay, let's think about what it would take to build a fence around my backyard. How much lumber would that require? How much would it cost? And so students were then engaging in complex mathematics to solve that problem. Or they would have students step outside and say, I want you to look up in the sky and what kinds of clouds do you see? Draw a picture of the clouds that you're seeing. Let's label those, let's name those. And now let's think about what climate forces are creating those clouds, right? Why are some clouds flat? Why are some puffy? Why are some wispy? And so I think what teachers are actually finding is that this moment has been a gift, right? That by getting outside of their classrooms and getting their students outside of their classrooms and into the real world, they're finding hundreds of ways to spark curiosity. And I think moreover, they're finding by framing learning around curiosity and the real world, they are engaging some of those previously disengaged students because they're better able to answer two all-important questions that we all must answer to motivate students. And the first one is this: kids are always wondering in their minds, why do I need to learn this stuff? And what's in it for me if I do, right? When students can answer these questions to their satisfaction, they are far more likely to stay focused on their learning. And now that's a huge concern right now. Teachers are worried that when my students are no longer with me, are they still learning? And now that a lot of them have the option of not opening their laptops, we see them checking out. So actually right now it's more important than ever that we figure out how to get students intrinsically motivated to learn on their own. Now, first I can tell you, this is often difficult for teachers to figure out, why am I teaching this stuff? Why is it important? How do adults use this learning? But once you figure that out, once you are able to convey that to students, the whole process of learning becomes a lot easier and a whole lot more enjoyable for students and teachers alike. So that leads me to the second redesign principle here, which is, we often talk about sparking curiosity, which is an apt description. Curiosity can be this very powerful and sudden thing, but it can also fade really quickly. So how do we keep the curiosity alive in classrooms? How do we turn that into a flame that keeps burning, right? So it's really by designing learning experiences that hold students' interest and engage them in deeper learning so they don't forget most of what they learn. So how do we do that exactly? Well, we start here. We start by asking ourselves two big questions, right? How do people use this knowledge or skill that I'm teaching in the real world? And then how can I get students to show me that they can use the knowledge or skill? Let me give you a few examples, right? So one might be, we could ask students to write about a historical event from a particular point of view, from one particular actor in history, perhaps. Or maybe we get them to conduct and then write about a scientific investigation, explaining to us what happened there and showing us that they really understand the application of these scientific principles. Or maybe we get them to write an essay reflecting on a piece of literature, maybe reflecting on how it applies to their own lives. Because after all, that's why we read literature, right? To better understand the world and ourselves. Now, you may have noticed a recurring theme here, which is writing. And that's because, as it turns out, research shows that writing is one of the most effective ways to ensure that students deepen their learning and also engage in critical thinking. And by the way, it's also something that we can do entirely offline and at home during independent learning time. And students can also do it with a very widely available technology called pen and paper. So it's a great way to be engaging students when they're not always with us. I'll give you a few examples of how this deeper learning has unfolded in different places. One is in the Pacific island of Guam. In Guam, they're having a terrible problem with an invasive species that you see here called the coconut rhinoceros beetle. It is boring into the coconut palm trees and destroying a really important crop on the island of Guam. So we engaged students in a process, in a project that said, first of all, let's ask questions about what's happening here. Why is this species here? How is it destroying the crop? And how could we start to mitigate with it? They explored the options. They then designed a way to solve the problem. It was actually really simple. It was hanging these big plastic buckets in the trees. The beetles would fall in and couldn't get out. So then they created their solution. They went and tested it. They wanted to see how many beetles are we capturing. And they figured out ways to improve it, how to hang the bucket in the trees better. And then they also started to share those findings. And one of the things they had to share with the community is stop taking the buckets out of the trees. People are taking the buckets out of the trees because they were using them to go fishing. So please leave the buckets in the trees. They're capturing the beetles for us. I'll give you another example that is happening right now. This comes from a school in Australia that we've worked with. It's an elementary school. This is a fourth grade classroom. So when they moved to online learning, they brought students together into small teams and said, we want each team to write its own online magazine. They were going to write and publish a magazine for their peers. So they had to go research and edit stories. They had to actually have editorial standards and peer review each other's work, right? That was the rubric, the writing rubric. They also were required to use statistics and data. So they had to use mathematics, applied mathematics, to make sure those statistics were correct. Every day they would come together with the teacher and they would make assignments. They'd figure out, do we need to work together or independently? What has to happen today for the magazine to get published? As it turns out, this project went so well. Students so loved investigating and writing about things they found interesting that when they came back in person, they insisted on, we should still keep doing this online magazine. Okay? So let's think for a moment about what kids were doing. It was deep learning because of this. They were engaged in close reading of nonfiction, something we want all students to do. They were also using applied mathematics in the statistics, right, that they were reporting. They were researching history, science, society, everything that was going on around them. They were also really honing their writing skills. Every day they had to get better and better at their writing. They were also developing critical thinking skills. They had to make sure their arguments made sense, that they were providing the right statistics to support what they were saying. And they were developing collaboration skills, learning how to work together. Maybe most importantly, they were learning how to work independently, developing self-regulation as learners, which is something we all want students to do. So think about that compared to, having students race through the curriculum and forget 90% of what they've learned within a month. So this brings me to the third big principle for redesigning our schools. And maybe it's the question of so how do we get from here to there? How do we do this, right? And we have to really focus on building teachers' expertise. I think maybe the biggest thing we need to recognize in this moment is there are no quick fixes. As educators, I know we are conditioned and prone to want to solve our problems very quickly, to go find some ready-made solution that we can implement. You may even be thinking that right now. Okay, what's this guy selling? Does he have a program, a curriculum? No, I don't. What I'm talking about here is really going beyond a simple program. It's about developing teachers to become more thoughtful and intentional about what they're doing in the classroom, to be curious about how learning works and how our students' brains work and how they can design learning experiences that best reflect how students' minds work. Doing this, requires stepping back and asking some big questions like, what is so interesting about a museum that people will freely give up their time and money to go learn something? And how might we make our classrooms look and feel more like museums, right? Whether kids are actually in the classroom or learning online, how could we make that learning experience have the same allure as a museum, right? How can we make it so that our kids line up outside of our classrooms or log into their computers every morning buzzing with the same excitement to get in and start learning? In other words, instead of going out and finding a new program or insisting that teachers have to implement something, we want to create the same conditions for teachers that we want them creating for their students. Investigations that spark curiosity and that lead to application, real world application. In this case, it's creating more engaging and challenging learning experiences for kids. Now, the schools that we work with, often they find this as their starting point. It's to begin to think about what questions are we asking in the classroom, right? Are we asking questions that merely call on students to regurgitate what they've learned? Or are we asking the kind of questions that make students think about what they're learning and start to ask their own questions about what they're learning? And the way this process usually unfolds is that teachers identify the challenge. This is not unlike what the kids were doing in Guam. You identify the challenge and you investigate. And then you start thinking about what are some good solutions we might implement. You implement those solutions over a week or two. Then you step back and say, well, what are we seeing? What data could we collect to see if this is working for students? Are they more engaged? Do we see better results on our quizzes and so forth? And then we think, okay, how can we improve this? Where do we go next? Oftentimes, this is where teachers say, we ought to create more challenging learning experiences, challenging learning tasks that bring kids or make sure that kids apply what they've learned or show us they can apply what they've learned. So, we like to call this whole process inside out improvement. It starts with what's inside, I think, almost every teacher, right? It's a desire to be successful at what they do, to feel like students are lined up outside their classroom and anxious to come inside and learn. After all, nobody really wants to be bad at their job, right? Yet I know right now a lot of teachers are feeling very unsuccessful. They are worried their kids are disengaged, they're disconnected. And yet here's the thing that's also really important to share with teachers is that in nearly every school, something is going right. There is a bright spot where kids are engaged. And it's important to build on those bright spots and help teachers see them and think, how can we make these bright spots more consistent and commonplace all across our school? Now, I know we all want to get back to normal. I am one of them. But before we rush to get back to normal, let's ask ourselves, what do we want normal to look like? After all, normal was far from perfect. Many students were disengaged. They were forgetting most of what they learned, and they were not receiving the learning opportunities they deserve. And that's not because educators are bad people or don't care or not intelligent. It's because we've been all laboring under a flawed system. I think we can seize this moment, though, to recognize those cracks in the system and to find in those cracks a better way of designing our school systems and our classrooms to ensure that when we get back to in-person learning, everything doesn't go back to normal, but rather blossoms into a better normal. I love this quote from the philosopher Plutarch, right? That the mind isn't a vessel to be filled, but rather a fire to be kindled. I think that's what we're all about as educators, right? We want to light a fire in students' minds. So, I think our job as educators is to ensure that when students come back to school, that they find a better normal that sparks their curiosity, but engages them in deeper learning, lights their own inner fire as learners, and that can lift them to new places and also allow them to shine a light into the dark places. So, thank you very much, Shukran, for your time. I've saved some time to answer some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goodwin. I know it's early in the morning where you're at. I appreciate all the information you have gone through. Actually, you did kind of shed some light on some areas that I personally, I'm glad you brought that up. And if I have any questions myself, we'll be here forever. But I do have a couple of questions from attendees. I have a question that asks about staff development. And here's what it says. It says, how would you see staff development changing after the pandemic? Can you go ahead and give us some
Sure.
on that?
And I think some of this can happen now. I mean, I think it's really about it's thinking about your professional learning communities. If you don't have one, it's creating those professional learning communities where teachers come together. One of the things about this whole idea of curiosity is that, again, it's not just a simple, everyone come down to the auditorium or to the gym and learn something and then go back into your classroom. It is about pairing teachers together. What we've seen as being most effective is peer coaching. So let me give you a couple things that happen. One is that teachers actually either create or use a rubric that might help them think about, for example, our questions in the classroom. Where do we see our questions presently, and what would it look like to go the next step? And then they really work together, right? You have teachers coming into each other's classrooms observing, and a lot of times that's because they'll say, wow, I love what you're doing. I'm going to use that in my classroom. It's not a gotcha. But then also there are ways that teachers can provide for one another with feedback. Like, when you ask that question, give a little wait time, right? Give that 2 to 3 seconds afterwards. So I think what professional learning would look like differently is this idea of framing it around a big question. The other thing I also find, because I've done this with a lot of groups, a lot of teacher groups, when you talk to teachers about curiosity, they get really excited. And they said, you know what, this is why I became a teacher. So you start there with that sense of, don't you want to do this? And then you begin to build like, okay, what would that look like in the classroom? We have a number of resources that I can share with you that you can download. Some many are free, but it's kind of that idea of, instead of you all must do this program, you begin with the question. It's what we want our kids doing in the classroom too. Does that make sense?
Actually, it does. I appreciate it. I do have another question, if you
Sure.
don't mind. Uh, and it's really, again, that's another interesting point about staff motivation.
Mm-hmm.
Is staff motivation for self-improvement a challenge or an opportunity since the pandemic?
Yeah, yeah. I think I think there's an opportunity here because as I was, sharing, I think a lot of staff are recognizing that this just isn't working, right? And they're quick to blame the online, but I think if we can help staff understand that maybe what's happening is like what used to work in person actually really wasn't working in person. It was our kids just couldn't walk out of the classroom. But now that they're online, they have the luxury of closing their laptops or really checking out. So I think beginning with this idea of helping teachers understand that what we've been trying to do, and it's not that they're bad people, it's or that they don't care, they do care, but we need to rethink what we're doing here. And I think people are kind of getting to a point where they're realizing it's not just a simple tip or trick that I can use. I need to probably do some redesign. I will also share this with you. Schools that have really supported teachers in thinking about inquiry-based learning, at first, teachers sometimes resist. One of my colleagues shares a story about when she was in Melbourne. She was an assistant principal. She had a teacher in the last year of her career saying, "I don't get this stuff about inquiry-based learning. Why should I be asking kids questions?" Resisted, but finally had a moment middle of the year where she realized, oh, this is working. And then she shared, I'm the best I've ever been. I'm 30 years into my career and I'm the best teacher I've ever been. So I think it's not hard to tap into that feeling of teachers that they want to be good at their jobs.
Well, how about another question, Dr.
Sure.
Goodwin? I'm just going to ask you as much as I can. There's a lot of questions, but
Keep them coming, folks. Yeah.
um, well, we'll look for the ones that kind of tackle some really interesting areas here. We
Yeah.
have, what is the future of instructional design career after the pandemic?
Yeah. Yeah. So something we've been working with teachers a lot is to help them think about, as I mentioned, how does the brain work? And I think um, so I do a workshop sometimes where I'll ask teachers, can you draw the human circulatory system? In fact, I did this when I was in Qatar. Can you draw the human circulatory system? And most people can. There's, in fact, in the Museum of Islamic Art, there's a diagram, right, that somebody drew like in the 1400s, I think, of the human circulatory system. We can figure that out. Then I say, great. Now, can you draw a picture of the human learning system? And that's where I find teachers everywhere, not just in Qatar, everywhere they get stuck, right? They realize, I don't think I know how human learning actually works. Once you understand though how learning works and how we have to start by becoming interested in something, we have to commit to it. We have to say, okay, this is important enough, I'll dig into it. We need a moment to focus on something new. Then we have to process that learning, usually in teams, right? I have a conversation about it. Then I need to go practice and reflect on it. And ultimately, and here's what gets missed in a lot of classrooms, I have to go extend and apply that learning. And so I think what learning design can look like after the pandemic, we could be doing it right now, right? The better the learning design right now when kids are online, that same learning design is going to work when they're back in person. And I think what teachers might realize is there is a moment, there are portions of that learning cycle where they have to let go and let kids engage in independent learning. Not just going off on their own, but it's guided, yet it's giving kids that chance to think deeply about what they're learning. And as I said, to write about what they're learning, all of those things. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question. I think what we can do right now is what we need to do when kids come back, which is all the more reason to get started right now.
Well, it does answer my question, but as things changed, in regular classroom settings, we can assess students' learning. We can even assess teacher performance.
Mm-hmm.
In a classroom setting, it's like it's in a square. At this point, I have a question. It
Sure.
says, how teachers can assess their students' learning so that they can make sure their students' lessons are effective
Yeah, yeah.
since the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think what I would say here is that I think there is still room for that normal kind of pen and paper multiple choice assessment if you're trying to just capture, do they have the basic knowledge? But I think we need to move beyond, I mean, we need to use that kind of test just to check, have they grasped the big concepts, but then move into something that's more of a performance assessment, more of a project, more of a research assignment, something that really requires them to think deeply. And I actually think right now there's an opportunity because I know a lot of teachers are worried about the normal tests. How do I know my students aren't like sharing answers when they're at home? If you're giving more of a performance assessment, more of a project, it's harder for students to, it becomes more independent. You actually know what that project looks like because you see it unfolding over time. So I think the answer is really to shift to more of a performance assessment, a curriculum embedded performance assessment, and thinking about how if I have a 3 to 4 week unit, what's that unit going to end as? Maybe that unit culminates in a project, not in a test that we just do the test and move on. And hopefully does that make sense?
Dr. Goodwin, that does. It's always interesting talking to you. It's always, it just, you remind me of a lot of stuff that I tend to forget sometimes, and you always shed some lights on some issues that we need to keep in mind. This pandemic has really taken education into a complete different area, and it all depended on how we tend to perceive that area. And I'm glad that you look at it as more of an opportunity than a challenge, and so forth. Dr. Goodwin, thank you very much for joining us. I know it's still early where you at, so you can go back and snooze for a couple more minutes. And in the meantime, we will move on to the next session. Again,
Shukran. Thank you all very much. Thank you,
thank you
Dr.
very
Rockwell.
much, and I appreciate your participation.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.